Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Music Masterclass, and hopefully all is working okay today. I have no idea what the problems were yesterday. We eventually got it going, and the archived version of the MuseScore Cafe yesterday, I edited out all the technical glitchy stuff at the beginning. So if you want to go back and watch, you can watch without all that stuff. So. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thanks for checking in. Looking forward to checking out some of the music that I've seen submitted lately, and that's what we'll be doing today. I need to mention that, as always, this service is brought to you by the Mastering MuseScore School, where the link is posted at the top of the chat. This is where I have my online courses to teach you to use MuseScore, to teach basic theory, to teach harmony, to teach counterpoint, and more to come. So definitely, if you haven't already, check it out, both as a way of learning some new things and as a way of kind of supporting what's going on here. So, no gremlins today. Yes, I'm glad to hear that. So what I want to do here is I'm just going to start looking at some scores. Yes, last week was sort of a special thing, right, where I launched into my whole counterpoint spiel, and counterpoint's still going to be on my mind. I have to say that when I'm talking about creating music, there's really two main things I'm always going to talk about. One has to do with harmony. The other has to do with counterpoint. And I don't mean there's one specific thing about harmony. I mean some aspect of harmony or some aspect of counterpoint are going to be common threads in almost anything that I talk about. And then there might be some other issues, I'll talk about orchestration things or other arranging issues, all sorts of different things that might come up along the way. But it's not like we ever stop learning or talking about harmony or counterpoint. So just to kind of set a stage a little bit. So I've loaded up a bunch of scores that, or downloaded, I should say, a bunch of scores that people have submitted. But what I actually want to do is I'm going to just grab a handful of these and load them all now. But I also want to do something different. I'm going to go to the community site. And also plug for the community. It's totally free to join. You just need to create the account, and it's free to join the community. And then you can participate in all the discussions, and most importantly, share your music for me to comment on. And in some cases, I always love it when you upload the music, you make it public and you make it downloadable. But I know for various reasons, people might want to not do that. And I do want to take a look at a score that Jim submitted that we can access but not download. And I'm imagining he did that on purpose. Ooh, new comment from Jim just now. Okay, yes, his comment there. It's so many neat things, hard to decide what to leave out. This editing thing is definitely... yeah, something that comes up. But I want to take a look at a piece of Jim's that he submitted two versions of, and I'm going to take a look at both of these versions here. And the thing that I want to point out about them, what I'm going to try to do today, and sometimes I say this and sometimes I succeed, usually I don't, is I'm going to try not to get too deep into any one piece, but instead look at individual aspects of several of them. That's what I think I'm going to accomplish today. We'll see if I succeed. So let's see. And I'm always just checking on my phone to see if there's, additional comments coming in that I need to be sure to address, like, your sound isn't working again. Okay, so I'm going to play the first version of this piece, Wang Wang Blues, that Jim posted his arrangement of. And his arrangement is a very traditional jazz arrangement. It's got cornet, clarinet, trombone, banjo, piano, tuba, and drums. Very traditional instrumentation, and the overall style of the piece. So I'm not going to play the whole thing. I'm just going to play a little bit, and so you get the idea of it. I'm going to play that much of it from this version. And then I'm going to skip to a section. So that section is what we call a homophonic or homorhythmic texture, right? All the instruments, let me go back, have the exact same, at least all the melodic instruments have the exact same thing. Whole note, and then quarter, dotted half, eighth, whole note, quarter, dotted half. This is all the melodic instruments have what's called a homorhythmic texture. But meanwhile, the other instruments aren't necessarily playing that exact rhythm, right? They are playing their own rhythm. Piano's playing this kind of quarter note pulse, drums got what it's going on, the tuba's going on one and three. This is what we refer to as a homophonic texture, in which, yes, the other instruments are doing something that's different from the melody, but it's very much accompaniment. They are not getting in the way of the melody. They are not trying to assert themselves as more important. This is, in a nutshell, what most of the music that most of us have listened to, played, participated in, etc. This is the most common type of texture that we see. Instruments that are in essentially a homorhythmic texture, or voices perhaps in harmony that way, and then accompaniment, rhythm section, or other instruments providing accompaniment that's based on the chords but clearly in the background. Now, when it comes to things like counterpoint, that's one of the things that traditional jazz, traditional like as in New Orleans style 20s era jazz is known for, has to do with how it uses counterpoint. And he brings that in a couple places, but I'm going to skip over to letter G, which is somewhere around here. Looks like I'm in that section now because I recognize what I see in the notes, so I just need to come back. Here we go. So I'm going to play this section for you just so you can hear a more contrapuntal thing that is very much a part of this style. So that was the exact same passage that we listened to before, but as far as the melody goes, it's the exact same melody that we heard, right? Hopefully you recognized it's embellished a little bit, but it's the same basic melody that we heard before. Right? It's the same basic melody, slightly embellished in the cornet, but with all this other stuff going on in the clarinet and trombone. And so this is one of the things that we refer to when we talk about counterpoint. But the one thing that comes up in doing this is what we usually learning about counterpoint, like in my course and stuff, has to do with controlling all these details. And if you're arranging, you do control these details. But it's important to realize that this kind of stuff would also be improvised. So improvising counterpoint, you can't control the details. By that I mean you can't tell the trumpet player, hey, don't play this note because I'm going to play this note, and if you do, it's going to be dissonant against what I'm doing, right? You can't be communicating that. So what's going to happen is you're going to get accidental dissonances. You're going to play a note that you thought, hey, this is a chord tone, it's going to sound good. Someone next to you is going to play a non-chord tone, and they're going to be a little momentary clash. Well, those dissonances aren't bad. Bach used dissonance all the time. He just controlled exactly where he used them and how he resolved them. One of the great things about having a good ear is you will learn to play lines that are less likely to cause much dissonance, but you'll also hear that dissonance and naturally want to move to resolve it. And you'll get accidental dissonances and accidental resolutions of it that more or less work out. So even when you're improvising in this style, it ends up often pretty well working out that you get good things to happen. And then you would wonder, well, why bother studying these things? Well, it's because the particular things that happen when you do this accidentally are different than the things that would happen when you plan them. It takes skill to plan something to sound accidental. And I think that's what Jim is doing successfully here. He is writing things here that someone who was just planning this might have planned things a little differently. Um, and therefore, it wouldn't have had the same feeling that an improvised passage has. So, just looking at this measure right here, right there. So, we're looking at it in concert pitch. Good. Ba-da-dum. So the cornet has an A on the and of one. The clarinet, however, has a B flat right there also. That's a dissonance right there where the clarinet comes in. That would have been completely avoidable if you wanted to. If this were Bach writing that, he probably wouldn't have written a B flat there. He probably would have put a C in the clarinet there. But not that he wouldn't have allowed there to be dissonances in plenty of places, but that's probably not one of the places where he would have put his dissonance. So that right there on the and of one, right where the clarinet comes in, probably wouldn't have been a spot. There wouldn't have been a need to. If this line had been part of imitative counterpoint, if it had been imitating what the cornet did the measure before, then Bach would say, all right, well, I got to imitate what the cornet did before, so I got to use the B flat. But if you don't have to, chances are he wouldn't have. And so imitative counterpoint is one of the things that's going to lead you to use more dissonance, because you're like, well, I got to use this note because I'm imitating what happened before. I guess I'm going to be okay with the dissonance, and I'll make sure that good things happen afterwards. But when you're improvising, you just got to accept that those little dissonances are going to happen along the way. And yes, it's going to resolve because the clarinet line here is chromatic. B flat, it's just going up a chromatic scale: B flat, B, C, C sharp, D, D sharp, E. So even without doing the math, I can tell you that dissonance must resolve somewhere, because eventually we're leaving the B flat and we're going to reach a note that's consonant against the A. And it happens 2/8 notes later when we reach the C. And now we have some consonants. And then he keeps moving through some more notes, which creates some temporary dissonances, resolves that, and so forth. Eventually reaches an F at the start of the next measure, which is also consonant against that A. So this idea that as long as you keep moving, you can get away with a lot, that's one of the things that allows this style of music to work. The clarinet can play scales and arpeggiate. Well, if you can arpeggiate the actual chord. If you're going to play scalar lines, do so. And you know that whatever dissonance you create along the way, it's going to resolve in the next note of the scale, because that's the way dissonance works. There's never a time when two adjacent notes in a scale are both dissonant. In other words, if you've got an A in the melody or in some other part, and you play any scale you want underneath that, well, I shouldn't say any scale, you stay within the key, right? So if you're playing basically an F scale there, whatever notes are dissonant against that A, G would be, B flat would be, D possibly would be. The dissonant notes, the seconds, the sevenths, and the tritones, possibly the fourths, those dissonant notes, if you just move to the next note, a step above or a step below, it's going to be consonant. So as long as you keep this clarinet part moving, you're in pretty good shape. And then if you just have a basic knowledge of where the chord is, you can make a lot of good things happening. So for instance, the chord here says it's an F chord. Well, if you look at the clarinet part, you'd never know it. I would look at this clarinet part, B flat, B flat on the and of one, B natural onto C, our chord tone. The first chord tone we've seen is buried here on the and of two. And then we have a C sharp, D, D sharp, and E, none of which are in the F chord. Nothing about that line says F chord. However, it's a chromatic line that leads to an F at the start of the next beat. So that's the kind of thing that a clarinet player would actually do. Now, another thing that a clarinet player would actually do if he was improvising is he might kind of guess wrong as to where to start this line. Jim knew he could start on B flat because he like worked backwards probably and knew that if he started on the and of one on B flat and played a chromatic scale, it would reach F exactly on the downbeat. Well, when you're improvising, you guess. You say, well, I think if I start this note and start going up, I'm going to reach the note I want when I want. But you might be wrong. You might get there a little too soon, or you might realize, oh, I came up a little short. So you fudge your line a little bit. You throw in some skips instead of just steps, or you throw in, instead of diatonic steps, you throw in some chromatic steps. There's all these little tricks that you do when improvising to reach the note you want to reach when you want to reach it. And those little twists that you add, these little skips up and down, these little chromatic alterations, that's part of what's going to make the sound of jazz. So when I left a comment to Jim about this and said something about, the differences between Baroque and jazz as it comes to counterpoint, and he says, well, I don't really think of it differently. That's absolutely true. You don't think of it differently, but the details will work out differently, just as a matter of just they just will. If just by doing these things, you're going to get a slight difference in sound between jazz and Baroque music. And here's where I get to give you one of my favorite lines about this kind of stuff, which is that some people, like if you don't listen to jazz much, you might say, oh, all jazz sounds alike. You might say the same about, say, rap. You say, oh, rap sounds alike. Or maybe you say that about country music. All country music sounds alike. Or people who don't listen to much classical music might say all classical music sounds alike. Well, I have news for you. Everyone who says those things is absolutely correct. All jazz does sound alike. All country does sound alike. All rap does sound alike. All classical music does sound alike. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is all jazz sounds alike in that it has the elements that make it jazz. In other words, if all jazz didn't sound similar in some way, how would we know it was jazz? There's got to be something about jazz that makes it jazz. It doesn't have to be just one thing. Could be a collection of things, and you have, as long as you have two or three of these elements and not some of these other elements, that it's going to sound jazzy. The details can vary, but at some level, yes, of course, all jazz sounds alike. There's going to be elements to it that make it sound like jazz. So one of them might be things like this use of this chromatic scale. Not that using the chromatic scale makes you sound like jazz, but it's one of those elements that is going to commonly be the case. Chromatic fragments of lines. That was one of the differences that we did see a little bit when I showed that Bird or Bach thing before and asked you to guess which line came from Charlie Parker and which came from Bach. And they were so similar in so many ways, but there was a difference in how they used chromaticism. I showed you that Bach used it, but I showed that Charlie Parker used it a little differently. So that's something to, just to keep in mind. And so as far as the improvised nature of these things, it's important to realize that different types of music, different sections will be more improvised than other sections. This is completely arranged, and realistically, a lot of this music, they know they're only in the studio for an hour and you got one or two takes. They're going to have worked out a lot of this stuff, maybe even written it out. In performance, maybe they learn it from a recording and they just play what they heard on the recording for these sections to make sure those sections work out. And then there might be other sections that are more improvised. The degree to which things are worked out and the degree to which they're improvised will vary from style to style, from musician to musician, from piece to piece, and from section of a piece to section of a piece. So all those things can vary. So, those are some comments about this. So would I never say that modern jazz sounds like trad jazz? Well, the thing is, the people who were playing in the 20s didn't have the advantage of listening in the 1920s, didn't have the advantage of listening to 2020s music. The people who live in the 2020s got to hear 1920s music. So I would say if you're not able to recreate that sound on demand, maybe that's something you want to be able to do. In 2020 or 2021, I want to, when improvising, be able to draw on whatever sounds I want. I want to be able to draw on the sounds of the 1920s if I want. I want to be able to draw on Baroque sounds if I want. I want to draw from 1960s jazz if I want. I want to draw from all these things. So I'm going to draw from all of these things, and it's going to cause my jazz to sound different from anyone else's. So I am going to just briefly play a little bit of this brass version because Jim created his other version here. So at many levels, it's the same arrangement, but it's not, right? He took out the rhythm section, he took out the drums, he took out the piano, and he took out the banjo. And there is now an extra horn in here. There's a two trumpets instead of a trumpet and a clarinet, a horn that wasn't there before, and then still the trombone. And what this means is now he has 4-note voicings. The original version had only 3-note, had only 3 horn players. So during that initial section, when it was all kind of homorhythmic in the horns, these were simpler voicings. These were like, this is an F chord, and that's A, C, and F. This is a C7 chord, that's G, B flat, and E. These are simple chord voicings. They're just the notes of the chord. And then when we get to the F chord, we have this non-chord tone for a beat. And then we have the dotted half note. We have F, A, and C. That's our F chord, right? So it's all triads. Well, as soon as he brings a 4th horn in there, he's able to bring in extra color. So in that last chord there, this is a transpose score, so I'm having to do the math on this a little bit. But the trumpet, the second trumpet, is playing G to E. Concert pitch wise, that's F to D. So he's got the 6th of that chord happening that he wasn't able to make happen before, when it was only 3 voices. Now, he could have added a non-chord tone in there, but he would have had to sacrifice something. With 4 horns, it's that much easier to incorporate non-chord tones. Now, it's possible to do it with 3 also, and there's very good ways of doing that, and that's something that I want to, when I talk about having additional courses, additional things that I want to put together, that's one of the things it's going to be about voicing techniques specifically for either piano or for instruments in which you want to get these sort of jazz colors in there. How do you do it with 3 instruments? How do you do it with 4? How do you do it with 5? How do you do it if they're if it's like one hand on the piano, so everything's got to be within an octave, or if it's 4 trumpets, so everything's kind of got to be within the same octave. But how do you do it if it's like a saxophone section and you've got like an alto or soprano saxophone on top and a baritone on the bottom, vastly different ranges. So there's different techniques for voicing chords in all these situations. And that's one of the things that I'm looking at wanting to kind of teach next. So, I'm following here in the comments. So yeah, some thanks also for the positive words on the counterpoint thing. And I'm actually going to look at Dean's piece here that he just submitted. I've got several things that I want to look at. And of course, I talked way more about Jim's than I intended to, because like I said, I wanted to kind of maybe try to do things, talk more briefly about things. But I am going to try to talk briefly about Dean's piece here because it's not a complete piece. What it is, it's showing what I'm doing in the course as far as giving you exercises to work on. So this exercise is to write a fugue. And writing a fugue is more than an exercise. It's a project. But I break it down into exercises. And so I kind of break down how to create the subject for your fugue so that it will work in canon with itself. We're not going to start off with that fugue having the subject in canon with itself, but later on in the fugue, we're going to want to have stretto, which is the idea of the subject overlapping itself. So the subject here is this. do, do. Sorry, I didn't make that big jump right. That's our subject that he is writing. And he wrote that subject specifically knowing that he wanted somewhere to be able to have that subject work in counterpoint with itself. In his case, he made it work in counterpoint at the octave. And the way he did this was by carefully writing the subject kind of 2 beats at a time. Well, Dean, you can jump in and tell me if I'm lying, but this is the process that I laid out, where if you write it 2 beats at a time, when you come to that 3rd beat, you have a C sharp. What you do is, if I'm going to have canon at the octave, then wherever the point of imitation is going to be, in his case, he chose 2 beats, there's going to be an A in the follower here. So he knew that the leader was going to have to harmonize with that A. So he knew he had a few choices. C was one, C sharp was another, E is another, and then so C and C sharp, that's a 3rd above, or a 3rd below, F or F sharp, or a 5th above, E. And, thinking about what key you're in and what story you're trying to tell there is part of the picture. And when Dean says he was like going back and forth between using C sharp and C, what this tells me is that he hadn't totally decided what key perhaps he was actually going to be in. But let's hear this now. So he knew there was going to be an A in the follower, so he planted a C sharp in the leader. And then you copy the next 2 beats of the subject down here, and then you complete the next 2 beats of your subject by making sure it works in counterpoint. So he made sure that C sharp lined up with that A, and then again, the C sharp lining up with the A. He has the B lining up with the G sharp. In this case, there's not really any real dissonance going on there. It's not that you can't have dissonance. You just want to resolve it when you have it. And then you copy those 2 beats that we just wrote in the top voice down to the same place in the bottom 2 voices, and then again, extend your subject so that it works that way. So this idea of creating your subject so that it's going to work as a canon and it's only a measure and a half, right? You don't need to write a whole 16 measure, 20 measure, 80 measure canon. You just got to make sure that for the space of whatever this is really only 4 beats. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 1 note. That's all it had to work. 4 beats, it had to work in canon with itself. The whole thing is 6 beats long. It didn't even have to keep working in canon after that, because now the subject is done. It's reached the F, and that's the point at which he decided he's ready to bring in the next voice. So this technique that he's using here is the technique that I'm laying out in the course. I lay out the kind of step-by-step process. I go through an example of it myself, show how it applies to Bach fugues, etc. So you get the version that he actually chose, which uses the C sharp. And so he knows that now he's going to be able to use that later on in his fugue. But the fugue doesn't start that way. Fugues don't start off in canon like that. They start off with imitation, in which the second voice comes in after the first voice is done. But we now can put in our back pocket, we know it's going to work. And now here's the version where he did it using C. And so I'm already like curious about this, because you're hedging on a note that seems like a pretty important note, right? I mean, I'm looking at this piece as being in the key of A, and it's A major. As far as I know, it's in the key of A major at this point. But as soon as we bring in this F natural, I'm like, oh, are we in actually A minor? And that C sharp was just like a borrowed note in there. So it's a curious sound that's going on. But yeah, so that's something that Dean is working with there. Here's the version where he keeps it minor by using C natural. So that's much more how Bach probably would have done it, because I don't think Bach would have allowed himself that major thing to then suddenly become minor like that. Maybe he did it once or twice, but it's not what you would do normally. But hey, it's 2021, right? Not 1685. So we can do this if we want. We can have this mixture of major and minor. however we want. And so that's how he created that subject, but then it comes time to actually use it to start his fugue, and that's what he then does, is starts his fugue. So that is the subject. It's the exact same thing that he wrote here, kind of 2 beats at a time. He wrote this subject kind of 2 beats at a time to make sure it would work in canon with itself. And then to actually start the fugue, then you get to hear that whole thing unaccompanied. Then you hear the answer to that, which is the same thing, basically a fifth above or a fourth below. And here he's actually really adjusted this. It looks like you've actually taken the whole thing and made the answer be at the 4 instead of at the 5, which I hadn't really thought about or noticed before, but I guess you did that probably deliberately. Bach has done that occasionally, but your subject starts with A, and maybe it's A major, maybe it's A minor, but it's A, right? It's clearly outlining that little leading tone figure there, and then walking up 1, 2, 3 is talking about the key of A. But then your answer is talking about D. Well, D is a fourth above A, not a fifth above A, which is fine, but the norm is to go a fifth above. So when would you use a fourth? I don't know, when you feel like you want to. There's actually some, if you study Bach's fugues and find a couple examples where he does it, you could say, well, I think he did it for this reason, and you can find someone's PhD dissertation where they try to get inside his brain. But basically, you do it where you kind of feel like you want to. And so it totally works as far as I'm concerned. Part of what happens is the fact that by creating this subject and having it end on F, and that's where F was going to harmonize with that A nicely, it creates a situation in which you're like, okay, my subject's done. I'm on an F now. I want to bring in my answer. I can't bring it in on E because it's not going to harmonize with F. Well, what you could do is say, well, my subject's not done yet. I'm not ready to bring in the answer yet. You could have, like, if this were Bach, what I think Bach would have done is something more like the following. Pardon my surgery here, but I'm guessing Bach would have done something more like this. He would have let that D not come in yet, and maybe I'm going to bring it in on beat 4, even though for reasons that I was talking about with Dave, I don't think that would have been very common either, because it kind of messes up the sense of the time signature. But and then, so I think Bach would have juggled the end of his he would have added a little bit of a what's called a tail. So, like, even if you think of the subject as ending on F, we want the answer to come in on the E, assuming we want to do the normal thing. We want the answer to come in on the E, and then we know that scale degree 3 here, C, is going to harmonize with that E really nicely, so that, well, these notes probably aren't the notes that I would use either, because now I've changed everything else. But what I've done is I've added 2 extra notes called a link to the end of my subject, so that when the answer comes in, the voice that had the subject is on a note that harmonizes with the answer. So let me play just this much. Okay, so yeah, if it was just an oversight, that's great. If I were you, personally, I would try to take this both ways. So fifth. So when I talk about at the fifth, it generally means a fifth above, and when I talk about all the tonal adjustments that are made, changing, there are things like changing this scale degree 1 when it when we take it up a fifth, it'll become scale degree 5, and it can still feel like we're part of the one chord a little bit. And I talk about things like that. But yeah, there are examples of Bach fugues doing this, so I wouldn't rule this out. I totally would not rule this out. So I think that that's a fine start. Now I will say that once you've landed on this C sharp here, I don't want to hear the C sharp again in the other voice. That C sharp is already kind of a ringer, right? It's not not an actual chord, not an actual key note. It's not in the key if we're in A minor. So I would be careful about using it in two voices. But as long as by the time you reach the C sharp in the top voice, the bottom voice has moved to another pitch, you're fine, or you just change this top voice, because at this point, that could be anything. But yeah, so anyhow, there's my feedback, Dean. Normally, okay, so now here's an interesting thought. If you're aiming for D minor, this subject doesn't feel like D minor. Why? Because I don't hear any D. Well, if I listen to the subject all by itself. So I know you talked about that in one of the comments to one of the other Bach subjects. Bum, 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 ba-dum, ba-da-dum, bum, bum, ba-da-dum, the G minor fugue, which kind of makes you wait a little bit to understand what key you're even in, because it starts with scale degree 5, then that flat 6, then the jump down to 1, then down to the leading tone, back to the leading tone, and back to the tonic. Now we know where we're at. Here, this all feels like if we're in D minor, okay, that's the 5 chord. That would be curious, but you're really making us wait on it. And I think that's fascinating too. So if you are saying that we're in the key of D minor, you could totally do that. But you might want to think about giving us a little more D. Boo, bum. Something more like this. So now I've gotten to hear the C sharp do what it's meant to do, which is lead to the D. Because what actually happened here was your C sharp never got to function as a leading tone. It never led to the D, right? But we got to hear a G sharp that did lead to an A. So that's what fooled me into saying we're in the key of A. Now, the thing is, again, hey, it's 2021. We don't have to be limited by 17th century notions of how harmonic motion works. I like how this works, and I think it could totally work and totally be okay with the ambiguity here. And in fact, you could maybe exploit it more now that I've pointed it out. So I wouldn't be opposed to any of this. But yeah, it's all things to think about. And now your tonal adjustment makes more sense, because if I think of this A here as scale degree 5 in the key of D minor, well, that's what a tonal adjustment is. We're going to take that scale degree 5, and instead of taking it up a fifth to 2, we take it up only a fourth to 1, so that when the answer comes in here, it feels like we're still in the original key. So your original subject was a little deceptive as far as the key went. It didn't really establish D. And now you're establishing the original key in your answer. So in hindsight, I think it works brilliantly, maybe, in that, let me undo all my changes here and hear your original again. What I'm really hearing is a big extended 5 chord. 5, 1. So it's a really fascinating start to the fugue, 6 beats of the 5 chord. When you actually go to harmonize that, when it comes back in the original key, in the third voice here, now is when you're going to have to see if you can maybe make that harmonization be a little more interesting, so it's not just 5, 1, but it has little 5 1s and other things happening within it. So that's something else you have to be careful of when you're creating a fugue subject, that you don't make it so clearly all about one chord that it becomes impossible to harmonize it differently. And so in this version, which is really, this version here is different in that now it really is stating D minor, and you're able to do things like create these little 1-5-1s, right? So I would assume the same thing will be possible when you have this, except that C sharp might get in your way. Actually, that's not that spot. That's this spot here. So when you're on this spot, you might be able to have that be 3 different chords, just like you have this as 3 chords. It's, 2 chords really. 1 chord, another chord, back to the first chord. But that's all we need to have happen. You just need to make sure that this is going to work out that way. And so as long as your melody doesn't just arpeggiate a triad, as long as it's got some scalar passages in it, you're probably going to get that. But it's all the other things that are going on in this melody that make it not feel like it is D minor, that really is the 5 chord, is what makes me think, oh, it might be a little tricky. But, you can probably make it happen. You can almost certainly make it happen. Yeah, I think the key signature would have helped me understand it as D minor, but I still would have said, that whole first thing is and it's this attempt to make it be in counterpoint with itself here. That's also you came back to the C sharp. If you had taken advantage of the opportunity to take that up to an F there, then we could have heard the D minor sound a little sooner, because that F would have helped establish that. And then, if I make this be a eighth note and then 2/16, this will work also, but it at least has something that feels more like feels more D minor-y, right? So in this creating of the canon here, it's important to remember what key you're actually trying to suggest, so that you actually give me some of that D minor if you want. But I'm actually fascinated by this extended 5 chord that's being implied there. So it's worth exploring it both ways. When you come to a fork in the road, take it, right? So that's what I would say. You got a fork in the road here, take them both, and see where they both lead you, and see which makes you happier. So yeah, so anyhow, those were some observations about Dean's thing here. Yeah, and Joanne's observation about the 5 in a minor key, there is this delicate balance, right? Because you want to borrow this major 5 chord in a minor key, use harmonic minor, using that leading tone, and it is going to be a major 5 chord. And the trick is going to be, what can you do to still trick the user, not trick, but clue the user in to know that 5 chord is a minor key. And one of them is things like just bringing that F natural in sooner. So like the original version of your line had the F natural in the second measure, and until I heard the F, I didn't know I was minor. But all it would have taken is an F a little sooner. Not doo-doo-da-da-dum. I still would have done this probably. Except, you have to work that out with your canon and see if you're okay with it. By the way, one other observation, the D here would have been totally okay. This D against this A is a fourth, and you might say, oh, 2-voice counterpoint, I can't have fourths. But, okay, first of all, you can. You just need to resolve them by step, and this does resolve by step. But here's the other thing. This isn't going to be 2 voices when it appears in stretto. By the point in which this appears in stretto later on in your canon, you're going to have a third, maybe a fourth voice, and that could easily be an F underneath the D and the A. So you can cut yourself some slack and think, oh, you know what? This doesn't have to work as only a 2-voice counterpoint. It can work as 2 of my 3 voices. So that's something else you could think. So the question is, how many notes do you think is necessary to establish a key? It depends on the notes. So here, Dean's version didn't establish a key until he reached the F. So it took a long time. But on the other hand, 5, 1, done. In fact, just 1, I could establish the key with a single note. You might be in doubt, was that scale degree 5 or scale degree 1, but it's probably one or the other. So a single note gives you, with a fairly high likelihood of fairly high confidence level, a single note gives you a pretty good idea of what key you're in, because that note is probably either scale degree 5 or scale degree 1. At least it is in this style. And then, like the number of Bach fugues that start on something other than scale degree 5 or scale degree 1. In fact, in my handout that goes with this, I actually go through the entire well-tempered clavier and show what some of the options are there. So let me just do a quick show of that. So this is the subject construction handout, where I do talk about that whole stretto business. So some of them start with a 1 to a 5. 3 of them do. Only one of them starts with 1, 3, 5, but as far as well-tempered clavier volume 1, but that's not uncommon either. A bunch of them start 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them do. Some of them start 5 to 1. And I said that that's what the G minor one does, but G minor does something a little tricky. It doesn't just go 5, 1. It goes 5, 6, 1. So it's got one extra note in there, but it's still exploiting the relationship of 5 going to 1. So some of these are maybe a little loose, but it starts with 5. 5, 3, 1. Well, there's basically 2 of the fugues that do that. This pattern here, 5, 6, 5, 4. That you would think that that's maybe not a common pattern, but it actually is. There's 3 of them in Well-Tempered Clavier Volume 1 that do it, and a ton others besides. But if you look at all of these, they all start on 1 or 5. And this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 of the 24 fugues, because there's 24 fugues, one in each major and minor key. 17 of them start with one of these exact patterns. Of the ones that start with a different pattern, and like here, the C minor one, okay, it doesn't really go da-dum. It goes ba-da-dum-bum. It's got a little neighbor tone figure, so I'm allowing for some amount of ornamentation. But yeah, almost all of them start with one of these patterns. Of the handful that don't, I think they all start with either scale degree 1 or 5. They just do something different after that. I don't think any of the Well-Tempered Clavier Volume 1 fugues start on any other scale degree. If 1 or 2 do, and I forgot about them, I apologize for the slight misinformation. So I'm not saying it's impossible, but I am saying the vast majority of pieces in this style will start with 1 or 5, because it's going to be what allows you to do what a fugue needs to do, which is establish the tonic at the beginning and then allow for a smooth transition to the dominant when the answer comes in. So that's the thing. So would you start on a 4 chord? You would be hard pressed to find examples of Bach doing that. However, it's if you're going to start on scale degree 1, scale degree 1 can be harmonized with a 4 chord. And it's actually not at all uncommon that by the time the third voice comes in on your fugue, that would be the case. In fact, I think my sample fugue does that. This is like the sample fugue that I wrote to demonstrate what fugues do, and check this out. So the fugue starts B flat triad, obviously, right? And then when the subject, the answer comes in, it's also still suggesting the B flat, and then it kind of modulates to F, as they do. They move to the 5. But then when the subject comes back, it starts with that scale degree 1, but it's harmonized with a 4 chord. So this idea that scale degree 1 can possibly be harmonized with a 4 chord is a thing. And yes, this is my example because I knew exactly where to find it. But I will tell you right now, I would not have put this there if I had not seen examples of Bach doing the same thing. In fact, it's a really common thing to do, just because of if a certain scale degree is used in the counter subject, then it means that that scale degree is going to, well, this one right here, scale degree 3 in your counter subject, when you transpose this back down, because this counter subject here, this my counter subject, when I transpose it back down, back to the original key, becomes this, and it's going to give you, depending on what kind of tonal adjustments are made, and I cover all that stuff in the course, depending on what tonal adjustments are made, it may well be giving you scale degree 6. Scale degree 3, when you pull it down a fifth, is going to be scale degree 6. And so it's going to invite you to use a 4 chord, because your subject is starting on scale degree 1. Your counter subject is now starting on scale degree 6. It's going to say, hey, use a 4 chord here. It's not the only option. You can do tonal adjustments. You can treat this as a non-chord tone and resolve it. There's other things you can do. But the point is that this is actually a really common thing. And it's not hard to find examples of Bach doing exactly that kind of thing. So Joanne, I would say no, that's not backwards. That's pretty typical. That's what you normally want to do. I would say you have a sense of the key already in your head, and then the melodies that come out are expressing that key. Then you don't have to think that hard about how to make it express that key. It's going to happen more naturally. But the thing is, if you're writing a canon, which is exactly what Dean is doing at the beginning here, he's starting with just a few notes. He's not necessarily starting with that clear sense of the key necessarily in his head. And canons, predate the Baroque era, and they are often written in a sense in which we're not thinking as much about functional harmony, where we're thinking about intervals and so forth, and therefore thinking about which chord is which might not happen if you've been thinking in more Renaissance terms about two-voice counterpoint and the intervals and species counterpoint and all this stuff that you learn about in the course. So it's not atypical that if you start writing a canon, you might not have a strong harmonic plan in place. And by way of segueing, then I would say that's probably going on, Dave, with your canon here. I don't know if you had a harmonic plan in place, but to me it sounds like you might not have, because this doesn't feel like D minor, but that does. This feels like 5-1 in D minor. Now, this F absolutely could have been the third of a D minor chord, but the fact that there's these C naturals here, it's not going to support there being a 5 chord happening anywhere in that measure. And that's why when you want to harmonize it, you started off with, okay, here's my F, and you harmonize it with a D, so that, okay, I have my D minor. But at that point, after that D happens, it's not going to feel like D minor anymore, because the original melody there doesn't suggest D minor, and so the notes that you're putting against it in the flute aren't suggesting D minor. This all feels like F major, and specifically starting with a 4 chord. 4, it feels like it's a B flat chord, to be honest. It all feels like kind of a 4 chord with kind of a dissonance here that it's resolved a little funny. And so it's also creating some harmonic ambiguity there. And then we hear again what we expect to hear based on this part. We hear some D minor with a deceptive resolution to this B flat is then functioning as an appoggiatura. So it's establishing D minor, but only barely, because we only get a hint of it here. We don't get any of it here. And this is, I would say, almost inevitable based on what you wrote in the first two measures, because they don't support a specific key. And so I would say that I could have predicted, based on those first two measures, exactly what I was going to hear after that, which is harmonic ambiguity. So starting off with a clear harmonic concept is a good idea if you want it to make harmonic sense. And so if it's trying to sound Baroque, in which things do make harmonic sense, you're going to want to make sure this initial line supports that. On the other hand, if you're trying to make it sound more Renaissance-y and less about functional harmony, then in that case, you don't have to think about that, but you want to think about your intervals then, and think about whether that combination of three-quarter notes in a row that are leaping and one of them a tritone, whether that combination is going to give you the things you want. Because what it's going to do is it's going to pull you in a very specific place. It's going to basically, this suggests a diminished chord or an A7 with a flat 9. And then whatever you put in to harmonize with it is going to need to do the same. So here, actually this F, you escaped it there, but you still have this hint of a diminished chord. And so then when you bring in a third voice, it's also giving me more of that diminished chord, because again, we've got these notes that are trying to suggest this diminished chord. So every time you come to that passage, we're going to feel that diminished chord, and then is that going to feel as Renaissance-y as you want, is where I'm going with that. So I guess that's what I would say. So when I talk about the harmonic structure here, this line in itself doesn't suggest a particular harmony. And that's okay. It's okay for a melody to not suggest a particular harmony if you're not trying to write something that has a defined harmonic structure. And it doesn't have to be a regular one. Like when I showed you my, I love counterpoint round, that doesn't have, in fact, let me bring that up for a second. It's under examples. And I'll put it here. So this version here, oh, not that version, sorry. That's the version that I used for the sing-along on the video. But here's the version where you can actually see. This is all one chord because I've planted it in the canon so that I'm starting on scale degree 1, and then scale degree 1 comes up here, and then scale degree 3 is harmonizing that, and then that scale degree 3 goes up here, scale degree 5 harmonizes that, so that's all the one chord. But then when scale degree 5 comes up to the next voice, instead of going back down to scale degree 3 or going to scale degree 1 to give me a one chord, I harmonize it with an actual, with the leading tone so that I can get a 5 chord. Let me turn off the chord symbol playback because that's not doing me any favors. That is not an accident. I'm planning for that in how I laid out the structure of this, because I knew that just coming back to the one chord every measure would be boring, but I didn't want it to be randomly wandering. I knew that coming to 5 chords would work, and that way of doing it would work. That sort of advanced planning is what allows it to have a harmonic structure that's not repetitive, but isn't random either. So it's that sort of kind of pre-planning that can kind of make the difference, I would say. So the fact I can see that that's a nice line, but it's going to have those issues when you try to use that as a canon, because the harmonic structure that's there isn't going, like for instance, the harmonic structure that's there is going to lead to chord progressions that don't line up in these sort of traditional ways. So making sure that the initial part of your canon or fugue tells the harmonic story that you're going to want to live with, because imitation is going to do that. Imitation is going to mean, hey, we're going to hear this story being told over and over again. So it's important to make the story be the story you want. So that's maybe the best way I would talk about. So one thing I will say before I kind of wrap up here is cantus firmus. Cantus firmus, the idea of having a fixed melody that you then set counterpoint against. Don't get hung up on it. It was a common teaching technique in the Renaissance. It's not that relevant to much actual music. Some Renaissance music, yes. Some other music, yes. But I would say don't get hung up on it. The technique of just writing two-part counterpoint is something you want to master first. First, master the two-part counterpoint in itself. 3 parts, as I mentioned in the comments, adds an enormous overhead of complication to thinking harmonically. So if you can't think harmonically clearly in 2 parts and make your piece make the harmonic sense that would lend itself to Roman numeral analysis and sound right to modern ears, that's the thing to make happen first. Get that happening in 2 voices, even without imitation. Make sure you can make it happen without imitation first, then see if it can happen in an imitative structure, then start thinking about a 3rd voice. And then, yes, make it be a cantus. No, make it be free counterpoint. Then make it be a cantus firmus that you're writing against, then maybe see if you can write a 3-voice fugue, because that's going to, or a 3-voice canon, because that's going to be the hardest. So in any case, as I predicted at the beginning, I got way more wrapped up in individual pieces than I otherwise might have wanted to, but that's fine. It leaves me more to talk about next time. I am going to suggest that you all listen to When I Look at You if you haven't already. It's a really just a sweet, pretty song, and I think he does really nice things with the kind of textures. It's got voice with just guitar and some strings, and then he brings in some winds against it, right? And then he uses different rhythmic things here. Now there's more of a strum pattern that's going on in the guitar, and he's got different textures going on within a relatively limited instrument palette, and without ever leaving the overall feel of the piece. He's getting a good amount of variety in there while creating some unity, and I think it's a good study in that. And I also think it's a place where if you want to make suggestions about places where things could be, tweaked a little bit, I think getting some of your comments on that would be really lovely. And then I'll come back and hopefully see some of your comments about that next time. I also want to look at Heiss's sort of chorale piece here that starts off in a more chorale style and goes more contrapuntal as it works on. I'll look at that and any other pieces that you all want to put together. So what I would say is just keep writing music, keep doing what you're doing. I'm looking forward to seeing what y'all come up with, and I'll be there on the community to comment, and I'll be back here on the masterclass next week to talk about some of the music that's already there, whatever new music is posted, and just do what we do here. So I need to wrap things up here, so I'm going to do so by playing myself out. And here we go. Thank you everyone for being here for the Music Masterclass. I do this every Thursday. We just look at different aspects of making music and talk about the things. And yeah, I managed to talk about both counterpoint and harmony today, which, as I said, are going to be the things that come up often. Counterpoint especially because after just having launched the course, it's on a lot of people's minds. And Dean was specifically posting one of the exercises in there, and I wanted to be able to look at that. But yeah, whatever you're working on, post that. Doesn't have to relate specifically to counterpoint. Doesn't have to be anything related to anything that I've been talking about at all. If it is, I'm happy to talk about it. If it's not, I'm happy to talk about it. I just want to talk about music. So hope everyone's having a good week, has a good week next week, and I'll see you next time. All right. Goodbye, everyone.